Good evening, you all, and you all are welcome to Chilau Zonal English channel. And we are ready to start today's workshop for GC A-Level English. And today you will get a new exciting experience because this session will be conducted by two brilliant students, Miss Shalin Sumantiran and Miss Lavanya Dibe. They have successfully completed their A-level exam, obtaining an A pass for English A-level English. And I must thank them for being with us today. Then I warmly welcome you to on behalf of Fresk Chilla. And I express my sincere gratitude to our Deputy Director of English, Mr. Suruja Sundara, who provided the platform for organizing this session. And thank you, sir. And Ms. Shalim Sumantiran and Ms. Lavanya Dimal, over to you.
Hello everybody, good evening. I'm Shalim. If Lavanya wants to introduce herself as well, she can. So I think the arrangement, yes, Lavi, go ahead. You're muted.
Sorry. So I'm Lavanya. I did my A-levels last year. It's good to be here, and I hope what we do here would be productive. If there are any questions throughout the entire thing, feel free to ask. Yeah.
Okay. So I think the arrangement is that Lavanya will take over the first hour and cover 3 poems, and then I will take over the next hour and cover 3 short stories briefly. So I don't think there's any further need for formalities unless Ms. Wiley wants to say anything. If she doesn't, then I hand this over to Lavanya.
Thank you. So first of all, what I'm going to be doing is just looking at 3 poems, basically Suicide in the Trenches, Animal Crackers, and Explosion, right? Those are the 3 that are focused on war and conflict. And I'm guessing most of you have covered all 3 poems to some extent, but we'll just do a quick look at each poem individually. And after that, we can go to a more comparison sort of thing, right? And if I'm going too fast, or you can't understand me, or you feel like it's not helping, put it in the chat, ask a question, it's completely fine. So let's start off with Suicide in the Trenches, right? So obviously it's set in First World War, and the poem focuses on one simple soldier boy, right? And torn from what would have been a typical life of what he calls youth and laughter, right? Sassoon says boy, he turns into a man, a soldier, and is quickly kind of overwhelmed by the grim realities of warfare. So that's basically what the poem is about. And it's 3 stanzas. It's very structured in the sense that each stanza focuses on 3 different aspects. The first focuses on the soldier's innocent youthfulness before he became a soldier, right? Simple soldier boy, dreamed that life in empty joy. It's a very innocent portrayal that basically Sassoon is trying to show that the war exploited that youthfulness, that enthusiasm for life. And then the second stanza jumps straight into him in winter trenches. So it places the reader in trenches themselves, right? The site of war. And it's in this where the suicide happens. He put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. And it's just very almost emotionless, right? It's just he put a bullet through his brain. There's no more description there. And it's also kind of ironic that the fact that in war, usually people die at the hands of each other, right? That this is a suicide in war. So that echoes tragedies of so many soldiers in the war, right? Thousands of people like him. And all their stories would have probably been forgotten. No one spoke of him again. And the third stanza focuses back on kind of the public. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, and Sassoon kind of like speaks very directly and almost has an accusatory tone there, right? That that those who don't have a direct experience of what these men are signing up for are kind of cheering them on, and they really don't know the hell where youth and laughter go. So that's basically the first poem for you. If you go to Animal Crackers again, I think most of you are pretty familiar with it, but just to go through it, it's about the 1983 riots, right? In the backdrop of the 1983 riots. And it's a conversation between Richard de Zoysa, the poet, and his nephew. I don't know if you've already seen this, but it says for Dimitri when he's old enough to understand, right? So that's how you know that it's addressed to his nephew. And again, it's very clear cut in the sense that there are symbols. The lion stands for the Sinhalese people, the tiger, and the elephant, the party symbol of the ruling government at that time. And it's just a portrayal of what happened. I'll go through the structure and some of the more like the things like the all caps in more detail when we're doing the comparison, but that's just a rough idea, right? And Explosion is about the central bank bombings. It's the most recent event out of the three, where a truckload of explosives drove into the central bank. And again, it's a very graphic kind of explanation, graphic kind of portrayal of what's there compared to the other two, where we have descriptions like held eyeballs in their palms, blood splattered in the streets. And it's more of a graphic portrayal rather than what de Zoysa does, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So I'm thinking that in terms of each individual poem, you're somewhat okay. So I'll just get to, I've done this small note on a comparison. So I'll just share my screen. Right. Can you see my screen? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I just want you to keep all three poems side by side now that you've briefly gone through all three of them. And think of all three in terms of the overarching theme, right? Which is war and conflict. And war and conflict is a pretty broad theme, right? So that's the first thing that I think you need to take note of, is that these three, even though they all fall under war and conflict, that there are three different, completely different contexts. Suicide in the Trenches is World War I, trench warfare, right? Animal Crackers is about communal or ethnic violence, riots. explosion is about terrorism, completely different type of conflict, right? So so each poem talks of a different type of conflict, which means each poem, even though they belong to the overarching theme of war and conflict, has a different take on it. So that's what I've said here, right? Then if we look at each experience, right? Explosion, if you take explosion, Eveline van der Putten is not really narrowing it down to a personal experience. It's a very general description of what happened on that day, right? Truckload drove into the central bank, lives ended, eyes were blinded, women in sari held their eyeballs. It's just a very, it's not a personal experience. Whereas both Suicide in the Trenches and Animal Crackers engage in two individual experiences. So Suicide in the Trenches focuses on a simple soldier boy, and Animal Crackers is about a dialogue between the poet himself and his nephew, right? So because those two focus on personal experiences, that gives those two a different sense of approach, right? A more authentic kind of approach to war and conflict. However, both highlight the toll on young life in different ways, even though those both narrow it down to one is a simple soldier boy and the other one is a little toddler, right? Desoiser sees the effect of this little understood war, which is clearly seen in the child's fascination with guns, right? You pull the silly plastic trigger. The child has no idea about what's happening outside the window. That's why he says, don't look out the window. That's what the poet is trying to kind of protect him or protect that innocence. Whereas Sassoon is really talking about a young man's life that is completely transformed by war, right? And then ultimately lost. He put a bullet through his brain. So again, it's two different kind of experiences that way. And if I get to the actual narration of the violence, like I said earlier, Eveline van der Putten is probably the most graphic, right? The eyeballs in their palms, lots of imagery. Hands were severed like cucumbers, were crushed under brick and glass, right? So that readers truly grasp the graphical horror of it. Whereas Sassoon focuses more on the psychological trauma of it. A young boy's, what happens in a young boy's mind in the backdrop of the conflict. Whereas Desoiser's reference to the violence is steeped in, like I said earlier, lots of symbolism. So even if you didn't know the context in which the poem was written, you might not even understand that the subject matter was conflict at all, right? Produce a lazy, kindly beast. If you didn't know that the lion was the symbol for the Sinhalese people, you might not even understand what he's talking about. So it's a very subtle approach in that sense. Both van der Putten and Desoiser focus on the actual conflict itself as it unfolds, right? Both poems use fire. Eveline van der Putten says merged into a solitary broom prism of fire and fury, right? So two images of fire, and Desoiser uses full of smoke and orange stripes of flame. Whereas in Suicide in the Trenches, we don't really see any kind of well, we do have crumbs and lice and lack of rum, but that's basically it. Not too much on the violence of the war itself. So like I said, when I touched on the poem earlier, Suicide in the Trenches speaks of loss of life in a different light, right? Like I said, one would usually expect a soldier to die at war at the hands of his opponent, but the poet chooses not to emphasize on that aspect and draws instead on the terrifying conditions of war and the conflict it causes within a person, right? And how it drives somebody to the edge of despair and ultimately take their own life. So that's a completely different dimension. Then the last, two more things. Desoisa says Desoisa is the only poet out of these three that actually talks of the influence of national or ethnic identity on conflict, right? None of the Mary Van der Putten does not touch on it. She just calls it a truckload of explosives. She doesn't even give it a name. It's just a truck. She doesn't point to any kind of entity behind it. Whereas Siegfried Sassoon, we know that he's talking about World War I, but again, he doesn't really point at a particular entity other than the smug-faced crows. Whereas Desoisa, he's really the only one that talks of the influence of national or ethnic identity, right? He talks of the ethnicities, and he also talks about the government, right? So that adds a sort of level of depth to that theme. And again, Sassoon talks of the smug-faced crowds. The other two poets don't speak of this. He kind of shows how war is not only about the authorities that control it or the soldiers that take part in it, but also the crowds that encourage it. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye. He doesn't direct his anger towards authorities or political figures like Desoisa, but towards the general public. So in terms of the theme of war and conflict, I would say this is the comparison that I can make from all three in terms of the different contexts in which they were written, right? The kinds of experiences, is it a collective experience or an individual experience? And within that individual experience, the different influences on young life, the actual narration of the violence, right? And the kinds of imagery that is used, how Sassoon speaks of loss of life in a different light, how Desoisa speaks of national ethnic identity, as well as he points to certain entities, and Sassoon talks about this condemnation of the glorification of war in terms of the public. Yeah. So that's what I have for you from the theme itself. Are there any questions or anything that you're unsure of or that you didn't get? No? Okay. I'll just go and look at some more ways that you could compare the poems. Share my screen again. Okay. So in terms of the form, right? So what I discussed so far was more on the theme of war and conflict and how it branches out, right? Now we can kind of look at the form, the structure, the rhyme, the rhythm, those kinds of things, right? So Suicide in the Trenches, this is just my set of notes that I used last year. As you can see, there's lots of empty blanks. It's not complete, but I'm just using it so that it's easy for you to see all three at a glance, right? So Suicide in the Trenches is a 3-stanza poem. Like I said, each stanza talks about three different things. First stanza, life before war. Second stanza, life as a soldier. And third stanza, about the public, right? And I hope you have all three poems in front of you while I'm speaking. Otherwise, it won't make too much sense. Animal Crackers, on the other hand, it's not structured in that way. It's free verse, right? The lines are of different lengths. There are some portions in all caps. And you can kind of draw that to this general feeling of chaos, which is there throughout the poem. It's a riot, right? So We have things like full of smoke and orange stripes of flame, all hell breaks loose. Jackals run panting, rabid in the roaring's wake, right? It's a setting of chaos. So you could say that the structure kind of reflects that. Explosion, also 3 stanzas like Suicide in the Trenches, but it's not structured in terms of rhyme or anything like that. It's free verse, some random rhyme here and there. And it's more of, like I said earlier, it's a very graphic approach to war and conflict, right? So it's a series of scenes, almost like back to back, right? So you have the truckload of explosives, then you have this workday morning and the crows, you have the retired wage earners. It's just from one to the next. So that's kind of what I've said, an impressionistic account. So while it's graphic, it's also just switching from one to the other very fast. So that's why I've said an impressionistic account. Then in terms of rhyme, Suicide in the Trenches is really the only one that has a proper rhyme structure, right? Boy, joy, dark, lark, glum, rum, rain again, I, buy, no, and go. Whereas in Animal Crackers, there's hardly any, I don't think there's any rhyme. In Explosion, you have certain rhyming patterns here and there, which is basically, I would say, if you take this example, the nearby vegetable seller's hands were severed like cucumbers. So sellers and cucumbers, it's, I'd say that rhyme is there to evoke a sort of irony, right? That you'd expect the seller to sell the cucumbers and not have hands that are severed like them. So that rhyme is more to evoke horror, evoke irony, that kind of thing, or even big or small, insurance protects them all. The fact that that statement is completely invalid in this situation, right, where there are so many people dead in this incident, and you have this voice coming out of the commercial, from the car of a commercial that says insurance will protect you. I'll send these documents across if that's if it's useful, but I don't think we need to go into such detail about meter and rhythm and that sort of thing. So if you look at the overall effect of the structure of all 3, Suicide in the Trenches, 3 stanzas, very regular, very simple. It kind of even has a simple, like nursery rhyme kind of style, right? So if that goes well with the theme of a simple soldier boy who's just naive enough to believe that it's honorable to die for one's country, and just loses his life. It's a tragedy, right? Whereas in Animal Crackers, it's a setting of chaos. Like I said earlier, you might even want to say that if there's a gradual progression from the shorter lines to the longer ones. So you could say that it reflects the increasing violence of those events. You could say that. And then in Explosion, it's just shifting rapidly from one to the other, from one scene to the next. It's a fragmented, impressionistic account of the incident, right? So that's it, I think, for structure. Moving on to tone. Look at Suicide in the Trenches. Like I said earlier, there's a sing-song tone towards the end, throughout the entire thing, right? And a nursery rhyme kind of tone, which is ironic because that's in the face of a very grim theme, right? A man committing suicide in war, and that kind of really adds to the irony. You could also say that the first stanza is more of an innocuous tone, right? A simple soldier boy, green that life in empty joy. The second one is more graphic, crumps and lies. And the third one is more accusatory, you smug-faced crowds, right? The fact that the poet uses the word you, completely, addressing the crowds directly. In Animal Crackers, there are a bunch of different tones, actually. So conversational for one, right? Because you have dialogues throughout the entire thing, and those are there in inverted commas, right? Draw me a lion. Does it bite? There are questions. It's very much a conversation, and that's reflected in how it's written, right? You have lots of instances of irony, right? Where, for example, my lord the elephant sways in his shaded arbor, wrinkles his ancient brows, and wonders if did he venture out to quell this jungle tide of rising flame, he'd burn his tender feet. So irony as well, obviously, right? And then in explosion, while it's graphic and gruesome, it's almost apathetic, right? Because it's just lives ended, eyes were blinded, right? That it's just lives ended, and there's really no emotion in how she portrays this. And then the third stanza is big or small, insurance protects them all. That's again irony. I think we'll take a look at imagery, and if we have
Excuse me,
yeah.
can you do the presentation slowly?
Sorry, yeah, sure, of course. I'm just trying to cover as many as possible. I think are you okay with what I did so far? So basically what I touched on here was structure and tone, right? All these form, rhyme. I didn't touch on rhythm, but mainly structure and tone. So I just did a comparison of all three. Are you okay so far? Do you want me to go back and look at anything that I covered up to this point?
It's no need. Continue.
Okay. So I think we'll skip to imagery because that's more of like a more of a name thing here. All these three poems have different types of images, right? So if you get a question on literary devices, I think talking about imagery is your best bet here. Suicide in the Trenches, you have auditory, visual, tactile, and gustatory all in one rhyming couplet, which is in winter trenches, cowed and glum, with crumbs and lice and lack of rum, right? So auditory image in the sense of cowed and glum, lack of rum, right? It's not just rhyme, but auditory images, if you understand what I mean. Visual in the sense of crumbs and lice and lack of rum, cowed and glum, right? Tactile in the sense of crumbs and lice. Crumbs you can kind of, crumbs is basically something setting off, right? So like I've said here, the sounds of artillery shells falling in the soft soil, right? So that's part of the auditory image there. The lice and the lack of rum gives you a kind of a feel and a taste of what that's like. And so you have all those types of imagery in just one rhyming couplet. In Animal Crackers, you have a different set of images in the sense that yeah, you can have the PDF of the presentation. I can email it to you. In Animal Crackers, the images are different in the sense of it's very much based around those entities that Richard Desoiser talks about, right? So lion is the Sinhalese people basking in the sun of ancient pride, talking about the pride that ethnicities have. Even the tiger, right? Vision of a Beast compounded of Jim Corbett yarns and Blake's talks through my mind. So that's a reference to Blake's poem, The Tiger, right? And Jim Corbett was a British hunter of tigers. So, so those are the images in relation to the entities, as well as the elephant, right? Wrinkles his ancient brows. And then again, the images of the violence. All hell breaks loose, a bonfire and some fireworks. Those are images related to the violence itself, the fire and the flames and the violence aspect of things. In explosion, you have auditory imagery in the sense of, in the first stanza, all sounds of a workday morning merged into a solitary boom, right? So you can almost hear it, the way she structured the lines. Even the cawing of the crows merged into a solitary, and boom is on a separate line, right? Visual imagery, Prism of Fire and Fury. Like I said, it's a very graphic poem with lots of visual images, eyeballs in palms, blood splattered in the streets. I think if we look at, I just want to cover something else here, and we'll just go back and look at some of these things, right? So the time frame, which is not something that is essential to how you compare the three poems. I don't think, like if you compare it to images, literary devices and that kind of thing, it's not really as important to talk about. But if you just look at all three and take note of that, that Suicide in the Trenches is talking the time frame of the entire poem, of what happens in the poem, is an entire year, right? How do we know that? Because the first stanza takes place in spring, whistles early with the lark, whereas, so when he was a simple soldier boy, it was spring, and then he's in winter trenches. So a year has passed and this transition has happened. This boy has had to become a man. This boy has had to become a soldier. The boy who didn't have any cause for fear in the first stanza at the beginning in spring now seems cowed and he's glum, right? In the first stanza, he was grinning and now he's glum. So the transformation that happens over this time frame. Animal crackers is just a few minutes or hours of the day, right? How do we know this? Because it's a conversation, right? So obviously it can't happen for a very long time. And in the middle of the poem, after but for the most part, indolent, biddable, basking in the sun of ancient pride, in brackets, there is this section, outside the sunlight seems a trifle dull. So a few minutes have passed since he started, right? Also, since we are talking about that section, this is the only poem that has things in brackets, in inverted commas and things like that, right? We already talked about how that adds, how the fact that there are lines in inverted commas adds to the conversational aspect of the poem. But why do you think there are lines inside brackets? It's almost as if Richard Deszoyers, the poet, is talking to his nephew throughout this entire time, right? Draw me a lion, does it, and the nephew is talking about, does it bite? And then he says, sometimes. And then this is almost like an aside in a play, right? He's telling us, outside the sunlight seems a trifle dull, and he's telling this not for his nephew, whom he's having the conversation with, but to a side. There's a distant roaring, there's something happening, a pride of lions cross at being awakened, something is on the way. He's saying this almost as if it's an aside in a play, right? So I'm just talking about that. That has nothing to do with the time frame, but since we spoke of this line, I just want you to take note of that as well. Explosion, again, a few minutes, right? However, even though it's just a few minutes, Eveline van der Putten does this thing of changing the pace, right? In the first stanza, it's a very slow pace. It says time staggered, right? Long second. She's emphasizing on this time frame, that time literally stopped, right? Just before this bomb set off. And then boom. So right after the boom, it picks up pace, right? Prism of fire and fury, lives ended, eyes were blinded. And this rapid sequence of these immediate events, like I said, from one to the other, like from one to the next, it picks up pace. So we have a slow pace just before the bomb sets off, a long second, time staggered, and then all these things happen at once. So it picks up pace. And then in the last stanza, it kind of, when it narrows down to this damaged car and this dead driver, it again kind of slows down to kind of reinforce this, the attitude of what this commercial says, right? Big or small, insurance protect them all. This meaningless kind of attitude of that line. And then if you want to take note of these three things, right? The setting of the violence, which is kind of related to the three contexts. So suicide in the trenches, it's in winter trenches. He describes the battlefield as the hill where youth and laughter go. In Animal Crackers, it's a riot. It's happening outside on the streets. So it's a different setting. He calls it a jungle tide, a party down the lane. And in Explosion, it's a central bank, right? We know that. And Eveline van der Putten speaks a little bit more on the setting. She says workday morning in the city, gives us a little more insight into what the setting looks like. Blood splattered in the streets, right? So a little bit more in terms of the setting in that poem. I think we spoke of irony and all these things earlier, so I don't want to repeat myself. I will send this to you if you think it will be useful so that you can go through it, but I think I don't want to overwhelm you with content either. So so what I talked about already in the previous note was the different aspects of the theme of war and conflict, right? And then in this, we're talking about the structure. So you can talk about form, you can talk about rhyme, you can talk about meter if there's enough time for you to talk about that kind of thing. Tone, very important. Imagery, because there are, all three poems have three different types of imagery. And irony, right, which I touched on when I spoke of all three poems individually. And just kind of take note of the different time frames and how that kind of shapes each of the poems, the time frame and the setting. I think that's it in terms of covering all three. I have an answer that I wrote for these three sets of poems. I think we have some more time. Are there any questions in relation to the three poems that you want answered? Is there anything more that you'd like me to cover? Or would you prefer if we got down to questions and how you can take these, how you can actually use these comparisons in terms of an exam answer, right? Because I talked about a lot of things. That's why I said I didn't want to overwhelm you with too much content. But in terms of the exam, there's very little time, 25 minutes for one answer. You need to be able to condense as much as possible. So shall I show you an answer, a sample answer, or is there anything else that you want me to cover? Why does De Souza refer to William Blake's poem, The Tiger? Okay. What he says is basically, it's the first description that he has of the tiger, right? So first it's draw me a lion, and then you have this description of the lion as lazy, kindly, all of that. And the tiger, if you look at the two, if you just take the poem and compartmentalize it as into two things, right? The lion and the tiger. Can you see the lion has quite a lot of lines, right? Lazy, kindly beast. Then there's a question: does it bite? Indolent, biddable, basking in the sun of ancient pride. Whereas the tiger, it's just one small stanza that's there, and packed into that is this reference to William Blake's poem and Jim Corbett, and it's just a very striking image that's there. So I'm not an expert, but I would say it's just to kind of bring out that stark difference that this lion is this very lazy, kindly beast. It's just hanging around. Sometimes it bites, whereas the tiger, it's a vision of a beast compounded of Jim Corbett yarns and Blake, right? Stalks through my mind. It's blazing nature's warning, black bars on gold, and that's it. So I would say to kind of contrast the two descriptions and kind of add to the two entities. Shalom, do you have anything to add to that? In terms of why he refers to Blake's poem?
I just think it's part of being like ferocious.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have much other than that.
So just that stark image of a tiger, right? So it's pretty. You can understand what I'm trying to say in terms of the lion and how there's no reference to any poem or any Jim Corbett or nothing like that. Whereas this tiger, it's portrayed as just a vision of a beast. It's a very stark image. Anything else? Okay. Then I'll just share my screen and we'll look at an answer. Again, these are all my notes and answers that I wrote. So I'm not saying this is 100% correct or anything. I'm just using what I used last year, right? So here, I think there are lots of ways that questions can be asked about these three poems. You might or might not get it in terms of violence or war or conflict, right? Like that, right? So if you get it in terms of the violence, I think you would be better off structuring it in the way that the very first thing that I spoke about, three different contexts. But you might get the same three poems with regards to certain related themes like poetry and nationalism, right? So if you look, all of you know what nationalism is, right? Love for your country. So if you take these 3 points in relation to nationalism, which is not really related to conflict, each of these does actually talk about a certain sense of nationalism. So Sassoon talks about the connection between nationalism and war this way. He exposes stereotypes embedded in these nationalist sentiments invoked in order to justify entry into war. There's a very clear appeal for boys to join, become soldiers, and that's like their kind of transition from boyhood to manhood, right? This simple soldier boy who had nothing but empty joy grows up. He grows up, becomes a man, becomes a soldier, and is now in winter trenches, cowed and glum, becoming an embittered man over the course of this year, right? You could also talk about how, because he talks about how war exploits innocent of boyhood, Sassoon also demonstrates this stereotype of this duty towards one country, right? There's this implied sense of duty in the sense that crowds kind of make fun of people who can't fulfill that duty, which is what he condemns in the last stanza. And Desoiza writes in an entirely different time and location, right? Sri Lanka. There he talks about the communal hatred sparked at the time under the guise of nationalism. So because he uses these symbols of the lion and the tiger, it's very easy for him to bring those things out. So like I think I mentioned earlier that he's the only one who actually addresses this thing of ethnicity and like directly. That the lion only bites if you pull its tail out, says that it is just another cat, right? So that's kind of hinting at this aspect of patriotism or nationalism, pride, identity, that when that sensitive area is dealt with, when you talk about nationalism in terms of pride and identity, that leaves room for violence, right? That the lion only bites if that kind of thing happens. And that can turn into chaos and madness. Vanda Putin talks about a completely different thing. She chooses to touch on the notion of national sovereignty. The violence perpetrated by the LTT, which is what she speaks of, even though she doesn't refer to it, was ultimately caused by national sentiments, right? Why did the LTT do all of this? For the desire for a separate state, right? But obviously you would only know this if you knew the context of the poem, because she only talks about the perpetrators of the explosion as a passive entity. If you look at each poetic voice in relation to patriotism, Sassoon clearly has a negative and critical attitude towards these crowds who encourage these values. They cheer when soldier lads go by, and they have no idea of the ugly reality that's behind all of this, crumbs and lies, right? And all the psychological effects of the pressure of having to fulfill one's duty to one's country. For this boy that he talks about, it ends in suicide. Desoiza is also bitter in the case, so he doesn't talk about the public, he talks about the authorities. He feels that the authorities are responsible for using this situation, for using nationalism to perpetrate violence. My Lord the Elephant, right, only encourages the chaos that these values bring out. He doesn't do anything about it, which is what this line says. So he is bitter in the sense that the government makes no effort to correct these distorted nationalist sentiments. Also, another thing that you can take note of is that in this sense, the violence is not actually directed at the actual enemies, the LTT, but innocent civilians, not a tiger, just some silly cat, right? Vanda Putin doesn't talk about the ideology much, but looks at the consequences of those nationalist sentiments. What I talked of here, what the LTT is, what nationalism might have meant to the LTT, and the consequences that caused. So although the LTT may have patriotically called for a separate state, the consequences were behind the women in sari whose eyeballs in their palms, right? Women in sari, vegetable sellers, it was those people who had to suffer. So I hope that was helpful in the sense of having to deal with these three poems in different topic. Any questions? Okay. I hope you got what I said. Thank you. Someone pointed out earlier to slow down. Anything else that you want me to clarify or you feel that I didn't touch on enough? Okay. So since we have a little bit more time, I just want to talk about one more question that I came across. The question is, the poems on your syllabus discuss men and boys in different roles. How are they conditioned and dictated by the society in which they live? So again, not completely related to war and conflict, but you can actually relate it to two of these. So these are an answer that I wrote, but I chose chimney sweeper, suicide in the trenches, and animal crackers, right? Because Vivi Marie van der Putten doesn't talk about the roles that men and boys play, even though she talks about violence, right? So I'll just skip through what I've written for chimney sweeper and talk about what I've said. Okay, what I've said here, right? So who says, I think someone, yeah, okay. Sassoon says, I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life at empty joy, and then effectively demonstrates how that boy has had to turn into a soldier, a man over the course of the seasons, right? So that's the role that men and boys play in war and conflict. That we see him now in Winter Trenches, Cowed and Glum, and that how he talks about how society forced simple boys to become men in order to have more numbers to protect the country, right? So I hope you kind of understand how, even though at first glance, when this thing says men and boys in different roles and dictated and conditioned by the society in which they live, it seems like this doesn't have much to do with it, but it actually does in terms of what Sassoon talks about, right? So how society kind of shaped boys to go to war to fulfill whatever the agendas the authorities had. So that's how you can relate that question to these poems. So thus, we see how societal needs translate into the different roles boys were forced to play. We also see this masculine notion of duty. I think I spoke of that earlier, towards one country, which even though Sassoon doesn't explicitly mention duty in the poem, by exposing how crowds cheer when soldier lads march by, he demonstrates how the government appealed to this sense of masculine duty, which meant gaining society's approval and praise, right? And then obviously he says that in ultimately failing to fulfill this so-called duty, the boy in the poem, in succumbing to his weakness and failing to quote unquote be a man, right, in putting a bullet through his head and killing himself, results in shame. No one spoke of him again. So I think that's one way in which these war and conflicts poems can come for the exam, even without explicitly mentioning war or conflict or violence or that sort of thing. Nationalism, duty, roles that society conditions you to play, you might get it in terms of those kinds of aspects. So if there are no more questions, I think we are done with the 3 poems. Are there any questions? So what I'll do here is, if you can just get your email addresses across to me, I can send you my notes. Yeah, I'll send the slides. What I'll do is I'll just drop my number in the chat here, and if you can WhatsApp me your email addresses, I'll send you what I have, including the sample answers as well. I might have a few more that I can send you. So I'll just you can WhatsApp me your email addresses and I can send you everything that I had, because I didn't want to cover everything that was in the notes that I shared earlier, because that's quite a lot. It's basically what I did throughout the year for to just help me study those poems. So you can go through it at your own pace and figure out which ones you want to use and which ones you think are worth it. If that's it, so WhatsApp me your email addresses. I'll hand it over to Charlotte.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have any digital notes or anything similar that I can WhatsApp or email to anybody. So you would have to rely on my word of mouth. And if you want to take notes, I would encourage it so that you don't forget this later, but it's completely up to you. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on 3 short stories in the syllabus: The Thing Around Your Neck, Eveline, and Interpreter of Melodies. How I'm going to go about this is I'm going to briefly cover each short story and cover basically elements of each story which might come up in the exam, what you might want to know so that you can have better answers if you're going to focus on on a particular short story in your answer. Finally, after I cover all 3 briefly, I'll just cover a few common themes between the stories, so that in case you get a question that says, cover, how do you evaluate this across 3 short stories, for example, you'll then be able to analyze each individual story. Of course, all this will be quite brief, so I encourage you to, if you, for example, you hear me talking about a particular element of a story, you then look into it more deeply and review this a few times by yourself as well, just so that you can write about it in more depth. Right. If there's any questions throughout, just drop it on the chat and I will get to it whenever possible. All right, so we'll start with Eveline by James Joyce. I'm sure that all of you know all the short stories, but I will very briefly just cover the story elements of each before I get into the analysis. So Eveline is about a girl called Eveline who lives, and this is published in a collection of short stories called Dubliners, I believe, by James Joyce. And it's basically a story about a cultural phenomenon where the middle class was paralyzed and they couldn't do anything to further their own happiness. And this applied to a lot of people, and it applied to a lot of the stories that James Joyce explained in the collection of short stories. So Eveline is just one of these people who has an opportunity for a better life through a fiancé called Frank. And the entire story is basically her thinking while she's sitting in her room before she leaves on the boat. And then at the very end, she decides not to leave, and as a symptom of that paralysis that I mentioned previously. So that's the basic story. It's quite a short story compared to the other short stories as well. But there's a lot of context to the story. So if you want to find out about Dubliners and other stories, you're free to do so. But James Joyce wanted to delve into the situation that he is familiar with, because he was also born into a middle class Catholic family. A lot of the subtext in the short story refers to the Catholic Church and, in fact, blames the Catholic Church in some ways. He moved into poor areas of North Dublin, and he basically experienced a lot of this, and he wanted to express it through his stories as well. So knowing that context of story might be useful, especially when explaining, if you have to explain the paralysis phenomenon, because you can explain that this was something the author drew from personal experience and that it was a cultural phenomenon that affected most people in that particular period of time and place. So I'm just going to cover very briefly then a few literary devices or things in the text that you should probably know about, which mostly just foreshadows the final event, which is Eveline deciding not to go on the boat. So the first is that there's a sense of forewarning or foreshadowing in the very first passage, when she breathes in the smell of dusty cretonne, right, which is a particular material, and that conveys a sense of melancholy or gloom, but mostly it's something familiar. So she's sticking on to something that she finds familiar. Secondly, when she looks around the house, um, she, for example, the promises made to Blessed Margaret Mary Alacoque, school friend of the father, these kind of things, the questions that arise in her mind is that she never found out the name of the priest, for example. So this is kind of referring to the fact that she has unanswered questions. She perhaps kind of regrets when she looks around her house that she doesn't quite know everything about it, that she's going to leave it. Thirdly, she thinks of the past. So in the first passage itself, when she thinks about other people, the Devines, the waiters, the nuns, the cripple, all of these things, she's reminiscing. And this is a sign again that she's kind of stuck in the past. And she thinks of the past as a happy time. And although everything has changed now, that was not she still thinks of that as a good life. And in fact, later on, she in fact says she did not find it a wholly undesirable life. So even though she's already technically made the decision to leave, she's still contemplating her decision. And in fact, it explicitly says she had consented to go away to leave her home. And then she asked the question, was that wise? So all of this, those at least 3 or 4 indicators of foreshadowing to say that she possibly was not convinced that she was going to be able to find the resolve to get on the boat and leave. Finally, she thinks of her father, and whether it's basically right for her to leave the father because he's been getting old, that he'll miss her. Sometimes he could be quite nice. All of this despite the fact that the father is quite abusive, and is responsible for quite a bad childhood. So all of these are things that you should know, because when you're writing about Eveline, or you can refer to each of these particular events or thought processes of Eveline to say that this is the reason she ends up not going. These are this is how the author uses stream of consciousness as a literary device to show that Eveline is going to end up not going. And since that is the kind of the climax of the story, Eveline making the decision not to leave, all of this I think is fairly important when you're going to write answers based on that. Finally, also I think in the subtext there's a reference to the effect of religion or the Catholic Church in particular. Um, so, for example, there's there's a priest being hung there. Uh, the father, I think, is quite religious. I think it mentions somewhere. And at the very end, she prays to God, that to direct her to show what was her duty. James Joyce, indirectly in this sense, does blame the Catholic Church a little bit for the paralysis that affects the Irish in this particular period of time. And I'm not sure if you get a question based on this, but it's something that you can add to your answers and show that you have a little bit more background knowledge about the text as well if you want. The final device to note is the way that the story is told, which is the stream of consciousness. And you might, for example, be asked about like points of view, how are certain stories told, and you can use Eveline as an example of a particular way in which the story is told, that is stream of consciousness, which basically follows Eveline's train of thought. What exactly is she thinking of in this particular moment? And you realize, like, physically, she just sits there and thinks, and that is basically 80% of the entire story. But the entire text is entirely composed of her thoughts, right up until the moment where she gets up and leaves. And this allows us to really get a deeper look into her psyche, her mental state, what she's thinking of, why she finally makes the decision that she makes. And we get to know the character and their motivation particularly well because of this literary device. So I think that's something to note as well. And if you get a question about how stories are being told, you can use this as an example. Next, then, let's look at the final, I think, noteworthy thing that's separate from the rest. So we know Eveline is stuck in the past to a certain extent. We know about the paralysis, the context of the story. There's one other character which I think is kind of interesting, which is Frank, her fiance. And I just think that you should know two things about Frank in order that you can either insert him into some answer or you can analyze your answer about Eveline to a greater depth. One is that everything about Frank seems good and attractive. I don't think there's a single line anywhere that shows like a bad side of Frank or a reason as to why she would not want to follow Frank anywhere else. He treats her well. He takes her out. He spends on her. All of these things. It says Frank was very kind, manly, open-hearted, and that's the way that he's introduced as, in fact. So the fact that everything about Frank seems good or attractive, but yet Eveline decides not to go with Frank, points to the power of the paralysis and the fact that she's so stuck in her past and in what is familiar, even though Frank is so good. Secondly, and this is a little bit like buried in the text, Eveline probably is not very much in love with Frank, but rather thinks of Frank as a means of escape from her life more than anything else, more than a partner. So, in fact, I think it explicitly says uh, Frank would take her in her arms, fold her in his arms. He would save her. I will explain a bit about stream of consciousness after this point. So Frank, although he's good, although everything about him seems good, Eveline does not think of Frank so much as a partner, somebody that she's going to live with, uh, but rather a way in which she's going to escape her life that she's not happy with, that she's unsatisfied with, even though she ends up choosing to stay. I think this can be used in your answers as well when you're talking about Eveline to mention that the primary motivation of being with Frank or choosing to go with Frank was not because she liked Frank per se, but rather because she saw a way in which she could live this life. And that again points to her mental condition. Yeah, before I move on to the next story, I'll deal with stream of consciousness. I'm not sure entirely what you want me to explain about stream of consciousness. If you want to, you can clarify a little bit more. But basically, stream of consciousness, and I apologize if I'm repeating, is a way in which the author tells a story. So similar to first person point of view, second person point of view, third person point of view, from which I'm sure you all know. Stream of consciousness is, although it's third person, it's a objective third party, whatever. The way in which the story is told is from Eveline's perspective, particularly what her train of thought is. So what is she thinking of? And you'll notice that she sees people passing on the street first. This leads her to think about what happened on the street, so playing with the neighbors, whatever. Then she thinks, oh, all of this has changed. I'm going to leave my home. Then she thinks about home. And then she looks around her home and sees all of the different things in her home. And then she thinks, I'm going to leave my home. Is that wise? Then she thinks about her job. Then she thinks about how her new life is going to look like. Then she thinks about her family. Then she thinks about friends. So basically, it follows. This was what started the first thought. Then that thought led to these thoughts. Then that led to these thoughts. And through that stream, through that following of a particular line of thinking, we understand finally why she makes the decision that she does make, um, and the factors that lead her to make that decision as well. The fact that she thinks her father is going to be lonely and that she thinks she must look after him. Uh, the fact that she did not find it a wholly undesirable life, that she has a sense of regret when she looks around the house. So that's the device used to tell the reader more about um, the psychological state of Evelyn. Um, yeah, so I think that covers Evelyn and like important things. If you have more questions about Evelyn, feel free to ask in the chat. But I want to just briefly cover each story and then cover some common themes as well. But feel free to ask. Right. So let's look at um, Interpreter of Melodies next by Jhumpa Lahiri. So while Evelyn, you should probably know a lot about the background of why this particular story was told, the author's um, motivation, so on and so forth. You can do the same for interpreter melodies, but in your answers, there's actually quite a lot to extract from the actual text as well. So unless you get something like very particular to the author, you don't need to rely on that too much. You should probably know that the author is a second generation immigrant, and so she's also like drawing from personal experience, things about the culture divide, so on and so forth, personal experiences that she has. But you want, I'm not going to cover that in too much depth right now. Uh, so there are a few things to cover here. And the way I'm going to cover this story is I'm going to look at some themes, but most importantly, I'm going to look at the characters in the story, because the characters that you're most likely to get questions about, and also the character you can explain you can talk about the characters quite a lot and analyze them quite a lot in your answers as well. Um, so let's look at the themes first. And I think the theme that jumps out easily the most in this entire story, one is the culture divide, but most important, I think, is communication. And that is a reference to the title of the text itself, which is called Interpreter of Melody. So interpreter, it's about understanding basically. How exactly is this theme of communication explored throughout the story? The fact that Mr. Kapasi is an interpreter, that he literally translates languages, and also that he can identify ailments in patients. All of this contributes to the theme of communication because Mr. Kapasi works in that. More importantly, though, when you're analyzing the relationships between characters, between Mr. and Mrs. Das, for example, they have a limited communication. They bicker all the time. When you look at Mr. Kapasi and his wife, the fact that they don't talk and that he's unhappy that they don't communicate. Mr. Kapasi and Mrs. Das, and since that is the basis of the entire story, the way that they communicate with each other, and yet you can see like a failure in that communication also contributes to the theme. So, for example, when Mr. Kapasi like fantasizes basically and thinks that the fact that she's asking for his number means that she's going to, or his address rather, she's going to write him letters. He doesn't quite understand what's going on. Secondly, when he thinks that, um, when he thinks he can relate to her because they're both in loveless marriages. And again, he's kind of missing the mark here because Mrs. Das is not interested in him because of those reasons. She's interested in him because she thinks that he can give her a cure for something that she's been carrying around. Um, so communication is something that you can analyze through relationships between different characters, drawing on specific examples like the ones I just talked about. You can talk about it as an overarching theme throughout the entire story, whether it's through the title, whether it's through Mr. Kapasi's job, even the the devices used or the symbols used. So Mr. Das uses a camera and a guidebook. And you can talk about how this shows that he's very disconnected from the real world, how he views the world through the lens of this guidebook and this camera. It acts as a metaphor, really, and it prevents him from fully connecting with the outside world and understanding what it's about. So you can use all of these different examples to deeply analyze the theme of communication in this story. Secondly, the theme on culture divide or culture clash. And the specific cultures here are Indian Americans and India, basically, because Mr. and Mrs. Das are from America, although they have Indian heritage, and they're visiting India. And they use the guidebook. They try and capture like photographs. You can definitely tell that they're tourists from the way that they're dressed, so on and so forth. They wear caps. They're dressed differently. They carry cameras. They have a guidebook. Definitely foreigners. Although they're Indian, they're not really Indian. They subscribe more to the American way of life. And so you can use these examples as well when you're talking about the culture divide between um, the Indian American culture or American culture and Indian culture. And Mr. Kapasi thinks that he understands them, but really he's unable to bridge this culture gap as well. When she talks about the fact that Bobby is not Mr. Das's son, but rather the product of an affair, he feels like disgust. He loses his infatuation, um, and he doesn't quite understand uh, the cultural differences between them, even though he knows that there are cultural differences. So you can use that as well as an example for culture divide in this particular story. Right, so let's look at some characters here. So I've already talked about Mr. Das a little bit, about how he used a guidebook and a camera uh, that acts as a kind of barrier between him and the world, and he's not connected with reality. It's also, I think, worth noting that he is portrayed in a little bit of a goofy manner. He's not. He, for example, when he says there's common ground between him and Mr. Kapasi, even though there's no common ground, just because they work like in barely similar kind of contexts. I can't remember the exact line, but he says you and I are very similar, even though he just teaches kids about something and Mr. Kapasi is like a doctor and it's completely different. He tries to find some kind of similarity. Uh, he doesn't say Bobby when Bobby is being attacked by the monkeys, for example. Mr. Das is kind of a character that you can talk about when you're analyzing other characters or other themes in the story, and that can act as a part of your answer. And I think it's useful to know because you can always insert these things into your answers and just expand it a little bit more and use Mr. Das as a way to analyze your answers even more. But let's look at the more important characters, Mr. Das, Mrs. Das, and Mr. Kapasi. Um, so a few things to note about Mr. Kapasi. One is that he's clearly infatuated with Mrs. Das at different points in the story. You can tell this because one, he notices small details about her. Throughout the story, you'll find that the author specifically writes what Mrs. Das is doing, like about her throat, about like how she's eating, and things like that. So the fact that it's from Mr. Kapasi's POV or what he notices really, and he's noticing small details, mean that he's basically infatuated with Mrs. Das. So that's a literary technique to show how Mr. Kapasi views her. He fantasizes about her writing to him, and he wants the trip to last longer because he wants to spend more time with her. Um, so all of these are reasons as to why Mr. Kapasi is infatuated with Mrs. Das. You can couple that with the fact that Mr. Kapasi himself is very unsatisfied with his own life, and he thinks he has had a sad life. So his job doesn't bring him happiness. He explicitly thinks that he is disappointed in his own life, and he has problems in his own marriage as well. All of this means that when he thinks Mrs. Das is paying attention to him, he is really flattered. She thinks that she's taking an interest in him. He thinks that she's interested in his job. She says that the job is romantic. He himself is starved for relationships. So when he thinks that she's taken an interest in him and he's very flattered, he becomes infatuated as a result. This, I think, you can use in answers when you're talking about communication as well, about how Mr. Kapasi understands all of these things and why he understands all these things. But more importantly, you can these are things that you should probably know when you're doing character analyses. So if you're talking about particular characters in the story, referring to the reason as to why Mr. Kapas became infatuated is important in understanding his central motivation as a character, why he is like this, why he is so flattered, so on and so forth. But let's look at Mrs. Das then. So I think there are a few defining traits of Mrs. Das. One is that she's selfish. Um, and this can be seen in a variety of ways. The most obvious way that it's referred to in the text, though, is that she doesn't share her food with anybody, even her kids. But more importantly, of course, the only reason she sees Mr. Kapasi as like a means to an end, the only reason she tries to get close to him is because she thinks that he can cure her. But at the point at which he cannot, or he says, "Do you feel guilt, or is it that you feel guilt?" Uh, she and that's not really a cure for her. She immediately leaves because he has not given her what she wants. So that's I think the main defining trait of Mrs. Das. There are other character traits as well, and you can, most importantly, look at the little details that have been sprinkled throughout the story. Mm, so the fact that Mr. Kapasi adjusts his hair shows that he's infatuated or he wants to be noticed. The way that Mrs. Das keeps the rice with her means that she is selfish. The fact that they wear caps shows that they are disconnected from the culture or that they're tourists. Um, and similar to this, the author, the Jupalairi, puts small details throughout the story, and each small detail, each line of text points to something important. And so you can refer to that as well in your answers if you're asked about literary devices. You can use language. You can say the use of language, the use of showing small details, the use of referring to a particular action that a character has made, are all devices that the author uses to convey meaning to the reader. And I think that's important because that shows that you understand how or why the text is written in a particular way. So yeah, and there's very particular details about how Mrs. Das is dressed as well. That shows that Mr. Kavasi is really paying attention. Um, yeah, so I think that covers, in my opinion at least, important things that you should know about the story. Of course, there is the important reveal as well as to Mrs. Das's story, but I'll cover that a little bit later when I cover comparative themes. Mm, yeah, if there's any questions about interpretive melodies, I covered some select things. I didn't cover like everything, obviously. But I think if there's any particular questions, uh, you can ask the host about that. It is being live streamed on YouTube, so I'm sure it'll be on YouTube for you to refer to later on if you wish. Um, yeah, I'll give a minute or two in case anybody has questions about Eveline or interpreter melodies thus far. Think about it a little bit. Look at your notes if you want to. And if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. All right. So I'm not seeing anything right now. If you have, put it in the chat at any time. Right. Let's look at the final story then. The Thing Around Your Neck by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Just as a side note, I've watched a TED talk by this author, and it's really excellent. And if you want to understand a little bit more about her, I encourage you to watch that as well. It's on YouTube. But let's get to the story, and I'll just turn to it in my own short story book as well. Yeah. So this is also one in a collection of short stories. And the way I'm going to cover this particular short story is I'm going to look at the themes mostly. So the characters in this story are not explored in as much depth as the characters in the other stories. Like we do get to know a lot about the main central character Akuna. We don't get to know about like the central motivations and things about other characters as much. We instead get a thorough explanation of a lot of different themes, specifically the theme about cultural divide in the story. And I think that that's the most important thing to know about this. So when you're being asked about the story, the themes and the way that the themes are explored, I think, are the best way that you can analyze this particular short story in your answers. So let's look at the way that the story is told. And I think the main device that you want to refer to in your answers is the fact that this is a second person narrative. You thought everybody in America had a car and a gun. Your uncles and aunts and cousins thought so too. This is quite different from what you would usually read. And the reason I think the author opted to use this is because everything feels a lot more personal. It feels like it's directly addressed to the reader, you, and you feel like you're personally like being spoken to. And it feels like you are definitely the one who's like you feel more impacted by the events of the story. Uh, so I think that's a unique device that you should take note of, and you can include in your answers, in any answer really. When talking about exploration of a theme, you can say the author explores it in this particular way. So the main theme that's covered here is that of a cultural divide between African people in the story say African, it's Nigerian culture and American culture. So I think there is a few important moments that you should notice in the story here, and that you can refer to in your answers. So the fact that the uncle says that America is of a particular way is give and take, and as soon as you leave, or not you, but Akuna leaves, and she walks into a restaurant, the manager there is an immigrant as well, and he thinks of immigrants as hardworking. So that shows that there is a particular stereotype or perception of how people of different cultures operate or are in the American in American life. He thinks all immigrants work hard. There are people who think they know about Africa or Nigeria, who ask that whether if you're from Jamaica, they think that every person with a foreign accent was Jamaican. When you say you're African, they say they love elephants and they would like to go on a safari. They say that they've donated money to fight AIDS in Botswana. So these are all examples that you can take from the text to talk about how Americans think of African culture in general and how it's very removed from the reality of the situation. Um, Afterwards, it does refer to the boyfriend, and the boyfriend knows a lot more about the culture than other people. But even then, this particular boy is still quite disconnected from the cultural reality of Akuna. So he's privileged, he's upper class, he doesn't eat meat, he takes time off school to like go around the world in Africa and Asia. All of these are things that are very alien and unfamiliar to Akuna, because she doesn't even imagine that those are possible. She didn't know that people could just take time off school. She's secretly pleased when she doesn't have to keep when she can eat meat, for example, because the boyfriend feels sick after she cooks for him. All of these things shows the divide between the cultures, even when it's about somebody who knows much more about the culture than your average American. So I think that's significant in showing the massive difference between the cultures. Secondly, the way in which they perceive being of a particular culture is very different as well. So, for example, when the boyfriend is or the boy is mistaken for an African in the shop because he understands, because he knows how to hold the oil or whatever, that is something that he takes pride in. But yet, Akuna is not proud per se of African heritage. In fact, she doesn't want the boy to come back and visit her in her home because she thinks that he won't understand that or he'll be disgusted because they are poor. So, in all of these particular ways, all of these examples, you can take from the text and show the massive cultural divide between even the boy and Akuna, and in general, American and African cultures. Uh, Closely related to this theme is that of the American dream as well, because from the beginning itself, there are certain ideas about America, about how everybody has a car and a gun, about how everybody is rich and had big house. These are quickly dreams that are shot down. Uh, but what Akuna does understand is that, or what she's being told rather by the uncle, is that it's a give and take culture. You give a lot, but you get a lot as well. Um, and this is starkly different from the culture that she had back in Africa, in Nigeria. Um, yeah, so that's the main theme, cultural divide. There's also an important element in the story, which is about the story of her father, um, and the way in which he is treated. This you can kind of understand the story in different ways. Uh, yeah, this particular story you can understand in different ways. But the most important thing to note is that the fact that they are poor uh, is not like it's the fact that they are poor means that they are treated worse even in Nigeria or in African culture, similar to the way that she is treated worse in American culture. So it shows that there's some similarities across cultures, and some people are always worse off. This is not a massive part of the themes or part of the things that you need to analyze. But I think it's worth noting that that story is something that sticks in her mind as well, and contributes to her mental state when she's in America. And it contributes to her dream of becoming like a lot more. It contributes to her aspiring to the American dream and therefore going to America and trying her best. So there's all of that. Right. I'm not going to cover this particular story in too much detail, because I think it's mostly about taking specific instances, like moments that happen in the text, and using those as justifications for whatever answer you're trying to write. For example, if you're trying to write about the cultural divide, all those examples I mentioned previously about the boyfriend's privilege and how it shows that privilege, about how the uncle talks about give and take, about how people in the restaurant ask her about her culture. All of this show massive cultural divide, and you use each example. Um, the fact that she doesn't want the boy to see her family and take her back with him. So there's all of these examples, I think, are the most important part. Um, right. So let's cover some comparative themes, and if I've missed anything so far in each story, I might cover it here. But also, if you have questions about this story as well, put it in the chat, because I didn't cover this in as much detail as I did for the others. Okay, so I'm only going to cover two comparative themes. And after that, I'll look at a couple of questions that I have from two past papers. So one is women and gender roles. And this is something that I don't know for sure if you'll get it, but I think it's quite possible for you to get this as a question, because a lot of the short stories feature women in different states in their lives. So, for example, even Cat in the Rain has a story about a woman. Uh, what is it? Action and Reaction, Everyday Use, all the other short stories as well. They feature strong women. In their stories, they feature different difficulties that women face. So I think it's very possible you'll get a question on this. I think these three stories don't cover it in the same maybe amount of detail that it's covered in other stories. But I think knowing some similarities across the stories is useful. So, for example, Eveline, it's not immediately obvious how gender roles play into the story of Eveline, but there are things that you can kind of extract from the story. So, for example, the role that she takes on of taking care of the father is a traditional gender role. She justifies losing her health and losing maybe further opportunities because she subscribes to this particular idea that she is the one who needs to take care of the house, take care of the kids, take care of the father. And that's something that she's constrained by. In Interpreter of Maladies, um, again, it's not immediately obvious how Mrs. Das has been constrained by gender roles, but it's very clear that her, her position in life was one that became unsatisfactory because she was a mother or because she was put into a particular gender role of having to take care of children. She eventually lost connections with her friends. She became unsatisfied with her place in life. She allowed herself to be seduced by another man because she was unsatisfied, because she had to take care of the kids, all of that as well. In the thing around your neck, uh, there is obviously the beginning where she is sexually harassed by her uncle, and this shows perhaps the fact that women are treated like this in society and have to contend with this. Also, you can attribute the fact that she goes back home. Akuna goes back home because she thinks that it is within her duty as a daughter to go back to her father's funeral, um, and she thinks that's part of her role as well. In all three of the stories, you can extract the circumstances that each character is in and say their circumstances are because they are women, because of gender, because society expects a certain thing of them, and therefore they subscribe to these gender roles, and therefore it leads to these decisions. So in the thing around your neck, you can say it leads to her going back home. In Eveline, you can say it leads to her staying. In Interpreter of Maladies, you can say it contributes to the dissatisfaction that Mrs. Das feels. In all these ways, you can kind of analyze the gender roles. But I think if you know your other short stories very well, so if you know Action and Reaction and Everyday Use, I think Action and Reaction actually is a really good short story to explain gender roles because it's very explicit there. So if you prefer to use that as a analysis, I think that would be smarter. But I want to point out that in each of these stories that have women in them, you can always, I think, extract the subtext that you need. The second common or like comparative theme I want to cover is the cultural divide. We've already talked about how Interpreter of Maladies makes this like a really big theme and explores it quite deeply. But I think this can be seen in all three of the stories as well. So in the thing around your neck, the thing around your neck is the big theme, right? America and Africa. The fact that people are really ignorant about it, etc. Interpreter of Maladies, Indian Americans and the culture of India, big cultural divide. These are very obvious. I think you can analyze the fact that there is such a huge cultural divide in both of these stories in a lot of depth. You can talk about how it leads to misconceptions, about how it leads to ignorance because you don't fully know about the culture, about how it leads to miscommunications. All of for example, between Akuna and the boy, there's a definite miscommunication. They get into an argument. In the case of Mrs. Das and Mr. Kapasi, again, it leads to some kind of conflict because he assumed things about her and didn't fully understand why she was like that because of her culture. So uh, again, the relationships between people using particular moments that happen in each story you can talk about the cultural divide. In Eveline, it's not immediately obvious why culture is such an important thing. I think you can extrapolate that there is a cultural phenomenon in Eveline, and that is the paralysis. And that's as a result of the cultural forces of the times. That's about the Catholic Church, so on. There is no real divide in the story. There is no big misunderstanding between two particular characters. You can say that Frank does not understand why Eveline makes a decision, or Frank couldn't predict this because he didn't understand this particular cultural phenomenon. But I think culture is a factor in Eveline as well. Yeah, so that I think covers two comparative themes and ways in which that you can analyze referring to each text. Of course, you can do a lot more than simply saying that there are similarities in these particular instances. Also, you should look at the differences between the two, and that's important, I think. So, for example, in women and gender roles, um, the way that Eveline subscribes to the gender role of having to take care of the father is very different from the way in which Mrs. Das, for example, slowly loses satisfaction in the way of life. There is no particular climax there, it's just a slow thing. But also, the gender role is not as enforced as it is in Eveline, where Eveline feels like she must stay back to take care of people. Um, the thing around your neck, for example, there's explicit sexual harassment, and that's something which is not seen in the other two, but that is the most pervasive or harmful way in which the gender roles, gender stereotypes are portrayed across these stories. So you can compare and contrast, and I think doing that will probably lead to a better analysis. In the cultural divide, the fact that people are, so again, Eveline is a little different, but in interpreter maladies and the thing around your neck, you can talk about how there's a slight difference between the two because Mr. and Mrs. Das are immigrants, right? They are second generation immigrants. So they do have a connection to their homeland, unlike the people in the thing around your neck who just generally have no idea about a Nigerian culture, and even the boy has only ever just been there and looked at it. Uh, you can talk about how these are tourists in interpreter melodies, about how they're just trying to explore things and look at things and trying to have a good time as a family. Whereas in the thing around your neck, this is an immigrant who is working her way up from the bottom, who is trying her best to make a good living, despite the fact that she's not being given a great hand. So there are a lot of differences between the cultural divide as well. Yeah. Finally, then again, any questions? Put them in the chat. Finally, then I'm just going to look at a couple of questions that I came across. The first one is, right, discuss how the theme of language and communication is presented in interpreter melodies. So we have already covered this, but I think it's worth kind of exploring how you can structure an answer to a question of like this. In any question about any short story, where they say, how is this particular theme presented in the story? You can do it in a variety of ways. The way that I structured my answer was I first talked about the characters. It was first portrait presented through the characters, through Mrs. Das and Mr. Kapasi, through Mr. Kapasi's uh, interaction with Mrs. Das, between Mr. and Mrs. Das, so on and so forth. Then I say it's portrait through Mr. Kapasi as an individual character. The fact that he's an interpreter, that he communicates languages, the way that he understands people's problems, communication. Then I talked about the lack of communication between the relationships, various relationships. And finally, then I talked about the devices, specifically the fact that it's Mr. Kapasi's POV, or not specifically Mr. Kapasi's POV, but from his perception of what's happening, and therefore what he understands of the issue of what's happening, as opposed to what is actually happening, and therefore the communication breakdown. Um, Yeah. So this way that I structured the answer is basically I grouped together common themes or common ways in which the theme was presented in the story, and then I just explained how it was presented in as much detail as possible, drawing from as many examples as possible. The next question is, Evelyn's immobility mirrors not only her lack of boldness, but also her lack of confidence in her partner. Do you agree? Substantiate your answers with examples from the text, Evelyn. So this is basically um, a question about the mental state of Evelyn. The fact that Evelyn was immobile or chose not to leave. What does it mirror? And the question suggests that it mirrors her lack of boldness or lack of courage, really, and also a lack of confidence in her partner. And you can agree or disagree. I think you're meant to agree, whatever you think is right. But I would agree to both of these things and say yes, it is first, and separate the answer into two sections. First, it is about her lack of courage, and then I say we know that it's because she does not want to leap into the unknown and she's more comfortable with the familiar. This is shown through her stream of consciousness, the fact that she cares, she's thinking about the past, the fact that she's regretful, the fact that she thinks about her father and thinks that the father is somebody who's actually quite nice. She's comfortable in the familiar. Therefore, she lacks the boldness to step out of that. A lack of confidence in a partner, and this is what I meant about Frank previously, where you can point out that although she sees Frank as a means of escape, she does not think of him as, her partner for life, somebody that she really, really wants to marry and make a life with. So it's very possible that she's not entirely confident in Frank, uh, and rather just latches onto him as a means of escape, which she ends up not being confident enough in to finally take that leap of faith. So separating your answers into two sections, and then using your examples wisely in both of the sections. So I already mentioned about the lack of boldness. The frank one, you can say, you can refer to specific lines in the text, which you've maybe memorized. You can say that um, I think there's a line that says Frank may even love her. So she doesn't actually know that he loves her as of that point in time. So you can refer to those details as well and use those as examples to substantiate your reason as to why you agree with that question. The final question then is, so this is one paper which had the format of short story, answer one of these questions. And I think I'm going to actually read all three of them and very briefly discuss how you can kind of relate from all the stories that we covered today. The first question is, examine the use of choice in determining character development, plot advancement, or individual emancipation with reference to at least three short stories prescribed in your syllabus. So basically, the use of choice by the characters and how does that affect the story? It's a bit of a vague question, but that kind of gives you more to work with, and you can write longer answers. So, what are the important choices that have been made in these stories? Evelyn made the choice of not going with Frank. Uh, Akuna made the choice of going back to Nigeria when she heard about her father's death. Um, the particular choice made in interpretive melodies, maybe not as obvious, but you can say Mr. Kapasi made the choice of being very straightforward and honest with Mrs. Das, and losing his infatuation. I don't know if you can call that a choice, but you can definitely say that he spoke in a particular way. And then Mrs. Das made the choice of deciding not to do anything about his situation in life. She is only like that because she is dissatisfied. She could probably do something about it, but she chooses not to. You could say that. So again, you refer to the three characters, Mrs. Das, Akuna, Eveline, and you talk about how that particular choice impacted their lives. The second question, evaluate how the female characters in the prescribed short stories determine the course of their actions, making reference to their gendered reactions and relationships. Make detailed references to at least two stories from your collection. So you only need two stories here. I think you can pick any two of these three. The question is really asking, um, how have these particular characters, female characters, when they are determined, when they're making choices, when they're doing some particular actions, referring to their gendered reaction. So basically, how has their gender affected them making particular choices and their actions? And again, Mrs. Das forced into the gender role of being a mother to take care of children, which leads to her being dissatisfied. Eveline feels like she has to fulfill the role of taking care of the kids, and her father leads to her staying behind. And finally, Akuna decides to return home because she feels like it's in her duty as a daughter, but also previously in the text, um, she has a relationship with her uncle, which is gendered. That means the uncle sees her as somebody who he can target uh, in terms of sexual harassment, and therefore that leads to her leaving the house and seeking a job with with another immigrant in the restaurant. So you talk about how the fact that there are women have changed their circumstances in their life such that it leads to these particular actions or choices that they make. The final question then, of the 6 short stories in your syllabus, which one do you consider to be the most effective in describing social injustice? Write a critical appreciation of the story. So this one is not comparative. You just need to pick one. I think The Thing Around Your Neck is a really good selection for this. You could talk about other short stories as well, which I haven't covered. But I think from the ones we just covered, I think The Thing Around Your Neck is good. And this is about social injustice. Social injustice is covered or portrayed in a lot of different ways in the story, through the difference between the poor person in Nigeria and the rich person in Nigeria, through the story about the father, the difference between immigrants and colored people in America, particularly Akuna's experience and Juan, the manager of the restaurant's experience. Um, the fact that the boy is privileged because he's white, or maybe, and he has affluent parents. All these are social injustices. Another social injustice, which is not related to the money, is the fact that Akuna is a girl and is therefore kicked out of the house because she doesn't want to do anything about. She doesn't want, because she's subject to sexual harassment. That's a social injustice. Um, the Yeah, and you can say immigrants in general, so like cultural identity, those people are also treated much worse, but I don't think that's really covered that deeply in the story. So all of these are social injustices, and the way in which it is communicated, and because the question is asking you about it being effective, it's communicated through the experience of Akuna. It's communicated through the stories that she relates, like the story between her father and the big man. It's communicated through literary devices, so the second person narrative, making everything feel a lot more personal, and therefore probably more effectively portraying the level of injustice. Um, and so again, you use all the different examples in the text, the moments in the text, the literary devices in the text, to say all this contributes to the exploration of this theme in this particular way. Right. So that I covered a lot of questions, and very briefly, because I want you to have an idea of comparative answers, to be able to identify where there are similarities and differences between themes or instances that happen between stories. And also, I want to I want you to understand that whether you're talking about one story or two stories, the way in which you can really analyze your answers by first the relationships and then the themes and the literary devices. Each story has several ways in which it portrays or explores a particular theme or particular like motif, you can cover all of those in your answers by breaking it down into those sections. And as long as you explain it well, you should be getting the marks. So I think I am done with 5 minutes to spare. So if there are any questions, then we have 5 minutes to answer the questions. So go ahead and put them in the chat. I'll wait a minute, and if there are no other questions, I'll give it back to the host. Okay. I don't want to wait too long. Okay, wait, I do have a question. Why did Akuna leave her boyfriend and go back to Nigeria? I think there are a lot of ways that you can read this. There are several different ways you can read this. Uh, so the one that I have covered today is partly gendered. So she feels like it's a duty to go back. She has been communicating with her family all this time. At first, she felt really homesick. She clearly loves. She clearly, even though like she was disgusted by her father in that particular story, she obviously worked very hard, and she probably loves him to a certain extent. Uh, and you feel, and she feels quite guilty perhaps that she didn't actually know that the father died. Uh, the fact that he died like 5 months ago, I think. Um, you were what it says she was wondering what you were doing when he died, whether you had been like, yeah, perhaps your father died on the day your whole body had been covered in goosebumps. Perhaps your father died on one of the days you took a drive to Mystic or watched a play in Manchester or had dinner at Shanks. This points to a certain guilt that she didn't know that her father died and she has not been in contact with the family. Uh, and then, of course, that guilt and that sense of duty led to her leaving. It is also an open-ended um, ending, so we don't know for sure whether she comes back or not. The story suggests that she does not come back because the final sentence says you hugged him tight for a long, long moment and then you let go. So she's letting go of her dream in America. She's letting go of this boy that she has met, and all the reasons for that build up to the story. So sense of guilt is explicitly mentioned, but also the fact that she failed in meeting the American dream. It was not what she expected. You can explain all of these things in your answer, perhaps, and explain that all this finally means that she decides to go back to her family. Yeah. So I don't think there's like a definite answer, like a yes or no answer, as in most things. But I think there are a lot of things that you can say led to the final decision. Any other questions? There's also the fact that I think um, she understood that there's a cultural divide between her and her boyfriend, or like the boy, because he didn't like his parents because they loved him too much, and that was a very privileged mindset, and she didn't understand it and got quite angry. You could say that that was part of the reason that she maybe decided not to come back. Any other questions? All right, it's 10 o'clock, and therefore I would like you to get some rest because I don't. 2 hours of lit is quite difficult to absorb, especially because we covered a lot. Um, so I'll leave it at that. If there are any questions, I guess you can reach out to your teachers. And I unfortunately don't have anything to share with you like Lavanya does, but hopefully you learn something. So thank you very much, and I'll give it back to the host.
Yes, thank you all for participating today's online session for A-level English. And my special thank goes to Master Shalim Sumantiran and Miss Lavanya Dimel for their interesting session. And basically on poetry and short stories. Once again, thank you, dear students. And my sincere thank goes to their dedicated teacher, Mrs. Vaidehi, for directing her students in a nice manner. And then I extend my special gratitude to our Deputy Director of English, Mr. Surujaya Sundara, for his commitment. And thank you all. And may God bless you all. And I wish you all uh, best at the exam. May God bless you.